Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. So this week I've mostly been playing Dune Awakening. It's out. It's pretty good. It's doing pretty well. At the time of recording this, right after a server reset on a Sunday, 143,000 concurrent players. It's not setting the world on fire or anything. I mean, that's not even enough to break into Steam's top 100 most concurrent players, but it's probably the most successful game Funcom have ever done. And they've done some good games in the past. Funcom, they're a Norwegian developer and publisher. They're responsible for stuff like Conan Exiles, Anarchy Online, The Secret World, but good isn't the same as successful, is it? Then again, I suppose you have to be careful when you start throwing around phrases like Funcom generally produce or publish good games, because, define good. It's largely quite subjective, isn't it? I mean, look at Bethesda's games based on the Creation Engine. Skyrim, or going back to Oblivion, even before that. I mean, we're talking about games here that are... I mean, the consensus of opinion is they're not just good, they are great. But they're not the most polished, are they? The old Bethesda jank. My God, there are bugs in Starfield that were inherited from Oblivion nearly 20 years earlier that made it through every iteration of the Creation Engine, all the way from Oblivion in 2000 and whatever to Starfield nearly 20 years later. And yet, they're still considered... Well, it's not Starfield. Obviously not Starfield. But its predecessors, Skyrim and Oblivion, are generally considered great games. Now, with Funcom, they've never achieved the same kind of success that, and we'll keep using Bethesda as an example because we've started, they've never achieved the same kind of success that Bethesda have with the games that they've developed and published. And they still haven't, even with Dune Awakening. 143,000 concurrent players or not, that's still a small change compared to, well, take your pick from over 100 others, because 143,000 concurrent players still isn't enough to break into Steam's top 100 concurrent players. But it's certainly fairly epic by Funcom standards. Because while they have done some, and I'm gonna say good games in the past, they've certainly never achieved this level of success. I think the first game that they were known for was Anarchy Online. I played it when it first came out in 2001. Yeah, it's a game that's probably older than a significant amount of people actually listening to me talk about it. I tried, but I couldn't get into Anarchy Online. It was basically an MMO that was trying to be the Matrix. The biggest issue I had with it was the UI. It was horrible. It was just an utterly impenetrable user interface. It was next to impossible to figure out how you were supposed to play the game, where you were supposed to go, what you were supposed to do. It was really, really bad. Also, it was 2001, and the internet infrastructure wasn't really there to support what they were trying to do with Anarchy Online. I mean, it kind of was, but it was rough. And yet, even though I really struggled to get into it, well, I failed to get into it, a lot of people did. I mean, again, we're not talking record-breaking numbers. It was no World of Warcraft killer. But it persisted for 20 years before they finally shut it down. So they must have been doing something right. Probably Funcom's biggest success was not an MMO. It came shortly after Anarchy Online. It was Dreamfall, The Longest Journey, 2006. You may have heard of it. It did very, very well, and basically allowed them to fund their next stab at the MMO genre, Age of Conan. Now, I didn't play Age of Conan, but I remember there was a big fuss about it when it first came out. It did come out to generally favourable reviews. Again, it didn't set the world on fire. But the one thing that every review, without exception, kept going on and on and on about, it wasn't the gameplay, it wasn't the setting, it was the graphics. Age of Conan's unique selling point was it had the best graphics of any massively multiplayer online game at the time. For 2008, they were actually pretty impressive. But that created all kinds of problems. You see, World of Warcraft, which was the one to beat at the time, and to a large degree still is today, it never tried to push the graphical settings. And that meant that anybody could play World of Warcraft. You could run that game on a toaster. You needed a fairly powerful PC to get Age of Conan running, which straight away limited the potential player base to people with full-time paying jobs who could actually afford the kind of PC that could run Age of Conan, and people in that category generally don't really have the kind of free time to devote to a massively grindy MMO like Age of Conan, because they have full-time jobs. And that wasn't the only issue. While the graphics on release were state-of-the-art by MMO standards, but this just created another problem for the game. This was 2008. Cutting-edge desktop GPU at the time was something like the GeForce 9800. But this was 2008. This was a time when Nvidia were releasing a new generation of GPU every year. So within a year, the game's unique selling point, its best feature, the one that all the reviewers were going on about, the graphics, within a year, the graphics were nothing special anymore, and it didn't really have an awful lot else going for it. And so Age of Conan did so well that within 3 years of release, it ended up going free to play. I think probably Funcom's most polished game, and one that I did play and did absolutely love, was The Secret World that came out in 2012. Not to be confused with Secret World Legends, which was the sort of watered-down Fisher-Price kiddie version, the free-to-play version of the game that it ended up turning into in 2017. The Secret World was a game where you played a member of one of 3 secret societies: the Knights Templar, the Illuminati, and the third Asian one whose name I can never remember and had never heard of. The whole idea was that ghosts and goblins and things that go bump in the night were real, but the general population weren't aware of them, and the whole thing revolved around these 3 different secret societies are all trying to manipulate things behind the scenes with the supernatural to gain power over the mortal world. The game was split into all kinds of different zones, and each zone was dominated by its own particular kind of horror mythos. So when you started leveling up a character, it was all H.P. Lovecraft, Shadows over Innsmouth and all that sort of thing. Fantastic game settings, just so much fun to play. Tough game, but there was nothing else like it, or if there was, it had flown so far under the radar that I'd never heard of it. Certainly it was Funcom's most polished title. I mean, it just worked. I'm sure I must have run into the occasional bug while I was playing it, but I don't remember a single one. It just happened that infrequently. Unfortunately, while it had longer legs than Age of Conan, it also ended up going free to play. In this case, 5 years after release, and also getting dumbed down and made a bit more user-friendly into the process. And then 1 year later, in 2018, Funcom produced their next game, and the last game that they would produce before Dune Awakening. It's been 8 years since Funcom's last title, and this was Conan Exiles. Not the most polished game Funcom have ever produced. Fun, and is basically the template for Dune Awakening. And you can kind of tell when you play Dune Awakening, because it is basically Conan Exiles, but with sandworms. Both of them are survival crafting MMOs, where you can build whatever you like, wherever you like, as long as you've ground out the resources to do it. And I think that Dune Awakening does benefit from Funcom's previous experience with Conan Exiles, because Exiles wasn't the most bug-free game. It had that build anything, wherever, whatever thing. It's just the building system didn't quite work the way that it should. I had a lot of fun in the relatively short time that I did actually play Conan Exiles, but there was no end of frustration when, the building system was sort of grid-based. So in theory, as long as you stuck to the grid, everything should line up, except it didn't. If you started building anything beyond a certain size, for some reason, the grid would just not align, and you'd end up with gaps in your structures, and it was just so frustrating, because you'd have spent days amassing the resources required to build your dream project, and you'd have had numerous different trial runs in order to get the dimensions and the scale and the placement of all the building blocks correct, and then when you eventually came to do it, the walls wouldn't join up. because for some reason the whole grid layout just ended up getting balked at some point halfway through. I mean, it was just so annoying. Well, there's none of that in Dune Awakening. The experience that they had developing Conan Exiles appears to have served them well, because all of the things that were potentially great but actually really annoying about Conan Exiles are not annoying in Dune Awakening. They just work. So that's really, really good. That's not to say that the game is 100% bug-free, of course. Oh no, far from it. I, again, haven't actually experienced any game-breaking bugs that I'm aware of, although I've read that people are having issues with quests that just aren't working, quest NPCs that aren't there, quest NPCs that are there but they can't turn in quests, and various other different common or garden general gameplay or graphical bugs and glitches. To the developers' credit, you know, I'll say this for Funcom, they're working on it. I think they've taken the game down for at least an hour every day since the early access launch in order to implement fixes. However, what I want to talk about isn't so much the bugs, it's when things are working as the way they're supposed to and it's still broken. Because that shit's funny. What are you talking about, Jingles? Well, the game definitely has a couple of issues, certainly things that I've noticed. And if you're watching the background video here, have you noticed that not one of the non-player characters has a nameplate? Now, when you're running around the world, clearing out bandit camps and stuff like that, it's not really that much of an issue, because anybody standing in a bandit camp is going to be a bandit. So, you know, kill them and move on. It's fantastic. But when you're trying to hand in a quest, the quest NPCs don't have nameplates either. And if you're in a particularly busy social area with lots of NPCs, there are 8 NPCs in this trade post, and one of them is the one that you're supposed to hand your quest into. Which one is it? Because none of them have their names displayed above their heads. I mean, it just seems like an issue that is so obvious. And of course, it's not just the non-player characters. Player characters don't have nameplates either. Now, in the normal course of events, this isn't a problem, but it absolutely can be when you're in one of the quest dungeons. Like, for example, I'm about to enter Imperial Testing Station number 163. Now, it is going to be chock full of hostile non-player characters, and I'm expecting that. But because they're not instanced, they're just part of the open world, there could be other players in there, either doing the same quest that I'm doing, or just farming it for crafting materials. So how am I going to know who's a player and who isn't? I'm not, because they don't have nameplates. Nobody has a health bar over their head, colour-coded to indicate whether or not they're hostile. So because you cannot tell from just looking at them who's a player and who isn't, the safest policy is just to assume everything that you see is hostile until proven otherwise, because all of the non-player characters in these places are going to be hostile. Quick word about PvP, or player versus player status, in Dune Awakening, because this is going to be important later. Generally, by default, this is a PvE, or player versus environment world. So if you come across another player out in the world, you can't attack them. Well, you can attack them, but it won't actually do anything. They will suffer no damage. You'll have just wasted a special ability on something that you can't actually do any damage to. But you won't have hurt the other player, you won't have caused them any problems. Now, that's true in most of Dune Awakening, but there are certain player versus player zones. The Deep Desert, which is endgame, and also certain places in the world. There aren't many of them, but there are some. They're usually things like Imperial shipwrecks, which are player versus player zones. However, places like this, the vast majority of the game, there's no PvP. So why is that an issue? Well, if I run into a room that has 3 non-player characters and 1 player character, and I cannot tell just by looking who's who, I'm just going to stab first and ask questions later, which is fine if the person that I stab first is a non-player character. But it's not fine if the person I try to stab first is a player, because I can't do any damage to players in a PvE game. So I've just wasted a bunch of attacks and possibly special abilities which are on cooldowns trying to kill a player who cannot be killed in a PvE dungeon. But you know who can tell the difference between players and non-player characters? Yes, the non-player characters. They don't get confused, they attack you. So I'm busy trying to stab somebody who is actually no threat because I can't tell the difference because none of them have nameplates, while I'm getting wailed on by the actual non-player characters. So yeah, all kinds of fun. But it gets worse, particularly in the low-level starting areas where you've got a lot more players who are, because they're new players, unfamiliar with the game's systems, and they're all trying to get the same quests done. It can lead to some quite comical results. I heard a story the other day. I didn't see it happen myself, but somebody told me they were in this dungeon, we'll call it, waiting for a quest NPC to spawn in order to kill them to get a quest done. You know, fairly standard MMO stuff. Fairly popular starting dungeon because they were standing around with a bunch of other players waiting for the quest NPC to spawn. The problem was nobody knew who was a player and who was the quest NPC. So the entire room was just full of people desperately trying to stab each other. Because they didn't even know whether or not the quest NPC had spawned. Because the whole room was just full of other people as far as they were concerned. And with no nameplates, they couldn't tell who was a player and who was the quest NPC. So everybody was just stabbing everybody else. In the vain hope that the person they were choosing to stab at that particular moment might have been the quest NPC who had just spawned. So, funny, but frustrating if it's happening to you. But, you know, no players were harmed during the making of this particular story, because no players could be harmed. It's a PvE environment. But Dune Awakening also has PvP, player versus player combat, where you can actually hurt other players. And in fact, hurting other players is kind of the point. So the entirety of the Deep Desert, Dune Awakening's endgame zone, is PvP enabled. But remember I said that there are also certain areas, not many, and they're kind of scattered few and far between around the PvE map, but there are certain PvP zones in the PvE map. Generally these are Imperial shipwrecks. There are a couple of issues here. One of them is not limited to Dune Awakening, because there are certain quests in what is essentially the PvE content of the game that will send you to these PvP zones in order to progress certain character class quest lines, which I find really annoying, but it is what it is. The frustrating thing is that once again, due to the lack of player nameplates, when you're balls deep inside one of these PvP zone enabled Imperial shipwrecks, carving up the non-player characters in order to get to the loot or the quest objective. Now in time-honoured PvP ganking fashion, other players love to wait until you're heavily engaged with a bunch of non-player characters before jumping on you. And I'm not complaining about that. I mean, it's kind of lame, but that's PvP. You know, it is what it is. No, what I'm complaining about is that in every other game of this nature, where PvP is a thing, you can tell who's a player and who isn't. So if you're paying attention, you'll see another player turn up, and it gives you a chance to burn a cooldown and just do something to help defend yourself. But not in Dune Awakening. And the other player might not even know that you're a player, although they'll have a better chance of figuring out who's who than you will, because generally the non-player characters don't fight each other. So if you're in one of these PvP zones and you hear the sounds of a fight in a room up ahead, there's a fairly good chance that there's another player in there. And they're probably fighting a whole bunch of NPCs. But they could be fighting other players. And you're not going to know who's who. Until you hit something and find that it doesn't die in 2 hits. Because it's a player. I mean, you can see the potential for mass aggravation here. And it's just all so easily solved. Just give everything a nameplate. You can even toggle it off if you want. If you think it breaks immersion, then fine. Just give people the option to toggle the nameplates off. But make it an option. And at least give us an option to turn them on. It's such an easy fix to what is... I mean, generally, most of the time, like I say, it's not game breaking. This is, in fact, the game working as intended. Most of the time, it's just annoying when you're trying to find a quest NPC and you can't tell who's who in a busy room. But sometimes it can get your ass killed. And there are, of course, other issues. Now, some of these I haven't actually directly experienced myself. Some of them I have. mentioned that Dune Awakening is a survival building MMO, and they have a fairly lax building policy, and the policy basically is build whatever the hell you want, wherever the hell you want. There are some exceptions, some restrictions. You can't build too close to an existing like in-game area that's already populated, like a trade post, for example. But other than that, build whatever you want, wherever you want. Well, the game has officially been out less than a week, and people have already found ways to abuse this in order to grief. Because of course they have. So, I'm pretty sure that initially, at least, people weren't, deliberately going out of their way to piss other players off. They just weren't considering the consequences of their actions when they built their bases in gaps between mountain passes, completely blocking off the mountain pass, which is, kind of annoying because it means if you're in a vehicle, you then have to dismount, climb over, go around, whatever, then resummon your vehicle and move on. So, annoying, probably not malicious. Slightly more annoying is when people build their bases right on top of resource nodes, like dew flowers, for example, which are, water, as you'd imagine, in Dune, on Arrakis, is a fairly important resource, not just because you need to drink it to stay alive, but it also, you will consume massive quantities of water in crafting. And one of the most efficient ways of getting water is to wait until dawn and then harvest dew from plants. And I've seen people plonk bases right on top of dew plant patches, basically denying that resource to everybody else on the same server. Again, possibly they didn't do it maliciously, but people being people, I'm sure that sometimes they have. Now, despite the game's relative infancy, and, nobody's really losing their mind over this sort of thing, but it is creating enough of a fuss that I have actually seen people who, they want to get their base in this prime location, but they are conscious of the fact that it's going to have impact on other players. And so they're still building their bases in these locations, but they're building them with access routes for other players by, for example, elevating the base off the ground and giving it an entrance ramp so they can get in and out of their spot of prime real estate, but it's not going to inconvenience other players who can just go underneath the base. They've left the access clear. They're not blocking off any passages. They're not walling in any available resources. So that's nice to see, a bit of consideration for other players. But there are always going to be those players who just don't give a shit, who don't take into consideration exactly how they're going to inconvenience other players by where they place their structures. And I've seen the community come up with unique and yet oddly poetic ways of letting people know that this is not cool. Because if you can plonk a base down basically anywhere you want, well, so can I. And if you're going to plonk a base down that's going to deny a resource node to everybody else on the server, or is going to block off an access route to everybody else on the server, you don't get to cry and complain about it when I build a base that prevents you from getting into your base. I've seen people doing this, and frankly I think it's quite hilarious. But it doesn't end there. I was talking about how the deep desert is the end game zone and it's a PvP zone. Well, the only way in and out of the deep desert is via ornithopter. These are the game's flying vehicles. If you've seen Dune, the movie, or read the books, you all know what an ornithopter is. First, and I've only just managed to build my first ornithopter today. Building an ornithopter is a colossal investment in resources. It will take you a long time. I say a long time, like a week, to farm the resources required and unlock the technologies required to build your first ornithopter, at which point you can fly wherever you want. It makes getting around so much easier, but it is 100% required to go to and survive in the deep desert. And even if you're not into PvP, you're going to be going into the deep desert because that's where all of the endgame crafting resources are located. But it is still a PvP zone. The thing is, what I'm about to tell you doesn't actually involve any PvP at all. It's the best kind of PvP. It's the griefing, trolling kind of PvP that doesn't actually involve a player attacking another player, but does involve a player getting another player killed. And it's all through abusing the building system in the deep desert, because you can build bases in the deep desert. Nothing built in there lasts, of course, because sandworms eat it if you try to build in the open desert. Although there's a range of shield wall mountains where you can build stuff. But there's a Coriolis storm once a week in the deep desert that basically wipes everything and resets it all. But you can build a temporary base in the deep desert on the shield wall, and you will be 100% safe as long as the base is powered and therefore it has shields. You will be 100% safe in your deep desert base from player versus player combat. But because you can build anywhere, people have figured out particularly devious ways of griefing other players flying around in their ornithopters looking for resource spawns. So let's say you're in your ornithopter, you're out there in the deep desert, you're looking for a spice blow or a crashed starship that you can salvage or anything that's good for resources. You spot something, you land your ornithopter, you get out and you start harvesting. And you have to be relatively quick because any movement on the surface in the deep desert, and this is true back in the Hagar Base and the PvE zone as well, any movement on the open sand will eventually attract a sandworm, and probably sooner rather than later. So you're busy harvesting whatever it was you landed to harvest, and another player saw you land. Quick as a flash, they land next to you, and then they build a base around your ornithopter. And then they take off and they just wait for you to realise. Because the only way in and out of the deep desert is by ornithopter. And now you cannot get... They haven't destroyed your ornithopter. They haven't done any damage to it. But you now cannot get into your ornithopter because it's got 4 walls and a roof built around it. And there's a sandworm coming. And sandworm death in Dune Awakening is the worst kind of death. In any other fatal situation, you can always go back to your corpse and recover your stuff, but not if you get killed by a sandworm. If a sandworm gets you, everything is gone.
Now, you might be thinking, well, you're kind of asking for it. If you're paying no attention for long enough for somebody to build 4 walls and a roof around your ornithopter, then you kind of deserve it. But you can actually toss a base up in seconds. Because what you can do is there's a device that will allow you to take a snapshot, like a schematic, of any existing structure. So you build something that's just big enough to put 4 walls and a roof over an ornithopter, and then you take a snapshot of it, and then you disassemble it, which refunds all of the building materials. So you have in your inventory the exact amount of materials required to build something that's big enough to put 4 walls and a roof around an ornithopter, and you have it saved to a schematic. So you can just land next to somebody else's ornithopter, drop this schematic over it, and within seconds you have 100% enclosed somebody else's aircraft. And then you can get into yours, fly off, and just wait for them to realise that they've got no way of getting out, and there's a sandworm on the way. It's really quite devious. And the worst part is, well, I don't know if it's the worst part, dying to a sandworm is pretty bad. You lose everything. But the ornithopter isn't affected. What do you mean, Jingles? Why is that the worst part? Surely that's the good part. Yeah, but no, it really isn't. They haven't destroyed your ornithopter. They haven't touched your ornithopter. Your ornithopter's fine. But they've just made it inaccessible. So you've just died to a sandworm, or maybe heat stroke, which is also a way you can die in Dune. Although it's probably going to be the sandworms unless they're having a particularly slow day. But your ornithopter's fine. Nobody's destroyed it. Nobody's even touched it. They've just rendered it inaccessible. But you can't go back and get your ornithopter because, well, it'll probably take you the best part of a week to grind out the materials to build another one. And in that time, the deep desert will have a Coriolis storm, which destroys everything, including your stranded ornithopter. Honestly, people are such bastards, but in the funniest way imaginable. And that's not all, because it didn't take long for people to realise that they could exploit the fact that vehicles in this game do not take falling damage to grief other players, even outside of the player versus player zones. So, vehicles in Dune Awakening do not take falling damage. There are 3 different types of vehicle in the game. There are the sand bikes, there are the buggies, like the thing I'm driving at the moment, and then of course there are the different types of ornithopters. Scout ornithopters, assault ornithopters, and transport ornithopters. Now, it doesn't take long at all to farm up the resources required to build a sandbike. A buggy is a little bit more of an investment, but as we've already mentioned, building an ornithopter, even the lowest grade Mark IV Scout ornithopter, is a colossal investment in resources and time. I mean, gathering the resources required to build something like the Mark V buggy you can see me driving is not trivial, but it pales in comparison to the amount of grind required to gather in the materials required to construct an ornithopter. So you can kind of understand why the developers thought, well, do we really want to risk people losing that kind of investment due to something like network instability? They're flying around in the deep desert. Well, it doesn't have to be in the deep desert. Flying around anywhere. It doesn't even have to be flying. You could be driving a buggy around on a cliff top, and then suddenly you have network instability issues. And then when you get back into the game, your vehicle's crashed and it's been wrecked, and you've lost all of the resources that went into making it, and you have to grind out the resources to build another one. So you can appreciate why they thought, well, that would really kind of suck. So they made the decision that no vehicles in the game, not just the ornithopters, the same with the buggies and the sandbikes, no vehicles in the game suffer impact damage, whether that's from flying into a mountain or dropping out of the sky and crashing into the sand. Does no damage to a vehicle. So I could climb into this buggy and drive off a cliff, and neither I nor the buggy would take any damage whatsoever. If I were to jump off a cliff, I would take damage. Well, I shouldn't, because you have things like suspensor belts that allow you to basically negate falling damage in the game. But if I were to jump off a cliff without using a suspensor belt, yeah, it would probably kill me. Vehicles take no impact damage. Players do. You can see where this is going, can't you? Players have been witnessed flying their not flying their ornithopters around, technically driving their ornithopters around, skidding along the surface of the ground, chasing other players and ramming into them, killing those players, while their ornithopter and the player piloting the ornithopter remains 100% damage-free. Now, the real kick in the nuts here is because they're not doing this in a PvP zone, the victim can't even take steps to defend themselves. You can't shoot back, because technically you're not being attacked. The guy doing the griefing is just crashing their ornithopter. The problem is they're crashing it into you, and you take damage from it, but they don't. You can see the issue here, can't you? I mean, it is a colossal dick move, and the developers are aware that it's happening. And I don't know how they're going to fix it, but they've promised that they will. So, Funcom's latest, Dune Awakening. Already their most successful game. It's not 100% bug-free, and sometimes when things are working as intended, they're not quite working as intended. Because the one thing that no developer is capable of anticipating, I don't care if you're Bethesda, Funcom, Electronic Arts, no developer is capable of anticipating the depths that people will go to be dicks to each other. Yeah, Dune Awakening. It is a lot of things, but one thing that it is not is boring. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.